people will show up. All right. Oh, there's Sir Four Loco. Doing three. Actually, yeah. Let's bring you up. Communist necessity. Coming across the fact that communism is a necessity. All right, so chapter 3, new returns. If we are to speak of a new return to revolutionary communism, then we must first think through the problems of an old return. Having so far rejected all the rearticulations of communism that attempt to distance the name from the conceptual content of its history, it would be easy to assume that this treatise is advocating a return to the way communism was conceptualized and practiced before the end of before the quote-unquote end of history was declared. Such an assessment would be simultaneously true and false. On the one hand, it is true that this book is advocating a return to an understanding of communism that has been distanced from the contemporary renewal of its name. Against the rise of postmodernism and chink radical theories, we have examined a return to the recognition of revolutionary science and its truth procedures, developed and established through the dialectical of success and failures that result in a rich theoretical terrain. Such a terrain is far more useful for revolutionary practice for making sense of the world so as to transform it than contemporary movementist communism. The former should not be rejected due to a Cold War ideology that has socialized us into thinking of it only as catastrophe. Moreover, there is a ahistorical discourse that has produced a totalized representation of past communist movements and theories. It is quite common to encounter the argument made particularly by postmodernists and post-colonialists that the Marxism of the past could not theorize anything other than a crude and Eurocentric notion of social class. On the other hand, this treatise is not arguing for the return of a communism that is unaware of the developments of social and theoretical struggles that have taken place since the end of the 1980s. I gotta get rid of this little thing in my glasses. Little dot. I hate little dots. On the other hand, this treatise is not arguing for the return to communism that is unaware of the development of social and theoretical struggles that have taken place since the 1980s. This is not a demand to return to a particular communism that was practiced directly after the October Revolution of 1917, or even a particular communism that was practiced in the course of the Chinese Revolution under Mao. The most obvious problem of making such a demand is the fact that these revolutions did fail. Although we should not comprehend these failures according to the end of history discourse that forbids memory, we should recognize that there were important truths established in these revolutions, hard won by the struggle of past revolutionaries. We should not fetishize the possibility of a perfect repetition. There is a rather dogmatic way of accessing our revolutionary past. Failures are attributed to a lack of fidelity to the perfect theory of making revolution, the result of the errors in individuals and the organizations they control. The solution by that logic would be to repeat precisely what allowed these revolutions to happen, but with attention to a proper and, quote, pure understanding of theory. Is this not the rallying cry of every marginal Trotskyist sect? Quote, if only Comrade Trotsky had been in charge of the Bolsheviks after Lenin, the revolution was ruined when Stalin bastardized a perfectly good revolutionary theory, end quote. As noted in the previous chapters, however, there is no pure communist theory, just as there is no pure science. The absolutists' conceptualization of science is one in which scientific truths cannot be challenged by successive experiments. This is a science closed to the failure and due to its closure dogmatic rather than scientific. The concept of necessity explains why this is the case. Encounters with historical necessity demand that we establish ruptural truths in continuity within an unfolding truth procedure. Hence, we must maintain the same standards of assessment when we engage with the terrain of revolutionary theory and practice. We must assert that there is no ideal communism to which we can ever return. There are no precise formula, but there are universal axioms. Universal axioms is just the original point. There we go. It is easy to conflate these two categories and end up either fetishizing or dismissing the concept developed throughout a history of revolutionary struggle. Many of us can easily recall those ortho-communists who frequent activist demonstration, actions, teach-ins, and panels, missionaries of a communism that belongs to the first 2 decades of the 20th century. These tragic individuals deliver the same interventions and denunciations at every event where they are permitted to speak. The same formula is given with little attention to the event's particular context. Quote, the solution is for the working class to unite and overthrow capitalism, end quote. Often this formula is meant as a denunciation because these unimaginative persons are under the impression that nobody in attendance has ever thought about unity or the overthrowing of capitalism. Their assumption is based perhaps on the fact that these events concern Palestinian self-determination or the role of politics in art or the current examples of state repression. Indeed, perhaps another reason many of us did not wish to identify with communism in the past was because we mistakenly associated it with those fringe dogmatists who were incessantly repeating vague claims about working class unity based on a working class that was clearly imaginary, because according to all empirical evidence, these, quote, comrades did not represent the interests of the masses in those names they spoke. They should be able to recognize such an old return to communism as a return to its ultimately conservative. Learning nothing of how struggles has developed since 1917 to the present, filtering nearly a century of history through unyielding categories of thought that, in fact, deforms history so as to remain ignorant despite a veneer and suave, quote, know-how. This practice of communism lacks vitality. I gotta look up this word because it says validity, but I know if it's not validity. Hold on. Hold on a second, I lost the word. Hold on a second, I lost the word. It's vitality. My bad. Of course, it is correct to argue that the solution is to unify the proletariat so as to overthrow Of course, it is correct to argue that the solution is to unify the proletariat so as to overthrow capitalism, but this is a slogan that deals only with the last stance. And as Althusser never tired of reminding us, the last instance often never arrives. How many historical moments and sites of struggle operate so as to mediate this truism about working class unity and force us to ask about the meaning of unity, the composition and definition of working class, the precise strategy of overthrowing capitalism? What does this sloganeering have to do with every particular event that may be talked about, may be talking about something that is so vital and also connected to the working struggle? Formal connected to the working struggle. Formalic maximums. Oh my gosh, gotta look up this word. Sorry, everybody. Formalic maximums. Oh my gosh, gotta look up this word. Sorry, everybody. I was right, it's formulaic, but it means formulaic. Means, where are you at? Effects. Come on, help me move it. Constituting or containing a verbal formula or set of form of words. Formulaic. Interesting. Formulaic. All right. Formulate maximums. After all, tend to shut down our ability to understand the content of particular sites of struggles. So, why is it that these individuals often assume that many of these other instances of social struggle, mainly because they do not resemble a doctrinaire definition of praxis, are not themselves about class unity and overthrowing capitalism? In other words, could these Marxist conservatives actually be opposing concrete class struggles by mystifying the debate according to an idealized definition of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie? We could ask more rhetorical questions, but there is no point. Most of us are viscerally repelled by the idea of becoming this kind of clinched Marxist. It is as compelling as becoming a Mormon. Jesus Christ. After us, let us go further, leaving behind these tragic communist conservatives and think through the fact of communist catastrophe. We should have no problem admitting that past communist movements did end in catastrophe. These are catastrophes not for the reason provided by various anti-communist narratives. Rather, the trauma was due to the very fact that the earth-shaking successes they established. So he's saying the reason why it was the catastrophe because they were earth-shaking successes they established. That is, the failures of both, okay, and that's what they're saying, but here we go. That is, the failures of both Russia and Chinese revolutions were catastrophic because they fell from such great heights. They had accomplished so much, unleashing the world historical potential of the masses only to collapse. Whereas capitalism is a catastrophe because it is of its successes. Communism was a catastrophe because of its successes were overthrown by its eventual failures. It is not tragic that capitalism is catastrophic because it is not a failure on the part of capitalism. According to its internal logic, it does precisely what it is meant to do: exploitation, commodification, over accumulation, etc. Indeed, the problem is not that capitalism doesn't work, as some anti-globalization slogans would have us think, but that it works very well. And we always say that capitalism is working exactly how it's supposed to be working. Past experiences of communism, however, have been tragic in the same way of that. Oh my gosh. Oedipus and Antigone and Hamlet tragedy are tragic. So these must be like, I think these are like names of people: Hamlet, Antigone, Oedipus, I can't say it. Oedipus are tragic. We celebrate them and mourn the ways in which they have been laid low. And yet communism is not a tragic hero that, upon dying, can never be recovered except in the literary epic. Communism's tragedy is due to the fact that historical necessity. It is always open to the future, reversed upon each new return that seeks to reignite the greatest that was overwhelmed by historical problems it could not anticipate. A seeking that proceeds by grasping the meaning of this greatness and what led to its tragedy. So he's saying the tragedy was like the end of communism when capitalism came in, and what he's saying, though, that it established greatness too. So there was great things that happened, and the failure was tragic. By accepting what's truths were established, what errors produce catastrophe. Each moment of communist necessity can possibly establish new truths and counter successive failures. Hence, the Bolsheviks under Lenin overcame the failures of the Second International under Kautsky and Bernstein. Hence, the Communist Party of China under Mao overcame the failures of the Third International under Stalin and Khrushchev. We do no favors to the revolutionary mass, past sacrifices, by acting as if this past is either beyond reproach or utterly reprehensible. To speak of a new return is to speak of a way in which to make sense of revolutionary history through the lived experience of the present. Historical materialism. Moreover, all of the questions raised by these radical theories that have rejected this revolutionary past need to be answered by this new return rather than dismissed. To speak of a new return is to recognize that the past always returns through the present. We need to recognize this return rather than allowing it to speak through our unconscious actions. History has its revenge, and it is not worth quoting that annoying, Santinian platitude, of which even conservatives make much ado, it's ADO, to recognize this point. Marx already recognized that same point in the course of thinking through social movements. Here, where history might indeed repeat as tragedy and farce, to be unaware of the weight of the weight of dead generations is to repeat all the mistakes of the past. Movementism has been doing this for decades. Communism can't afford to make the same errors. We can't. We can't afford to make the same mistakes. It's the whole point of observing these things. So, if we are to think through the possibilities of a new return, we must also think through the way in which such a new return emerged at the centers of capitalism in the recent past. And following this investigation, remember the ways in which there have also been new returns of all of the erroneous practices that could prevent us from pursuing a similar return now or even in the future. Then the same mistakes are repeated. Anti-revisionism and the new left, all of the reformist traps and false promises of speculative theory, and finally the return of groundless utopian communism, wherein the necessity of a new anti-revisionism can be discovered. Next thing, anti-revisionism. In the past generations of revolutionary struggles in the centers of capitalism, there arose a new left that also attempted to reconfigure communist ideology. The Soviet Revolution was approaching a moment of revisionism, and due to this approach, some argue that the need to return to foundations of Marxism for the reassessment of revolutionary philosophy. Both the Frankfurt School and the Situationists, to name two significant examples of earlier New Left theorists, argue for this return, and in the course of making this argument, defended the need for an academic reassessment of revolutionary science. These academic rapprochements, because they began as theories without practice, were largely incapable of recognizing those movements that were also calling the current state of revolutionary practice into question, but were doing so in a manner that ignored the conscious academic insights of the New Left. For the New Left did not really grasp the significance of the Chinese Revolution, just as it began without a concrete understanding of the innumerable anti-colonial revolutions influenced by that world historical event in China. While this initially academic regroupment argued for theoretically compelling but practically banal reboot of Marxian philosophy and, quote, other left, the left of the peripheries, the revolutions beyond the scope of academic civility, demanding a return to revolutionary Marxism that would consider uncouth, but in this return also a theoretical development beyond the limits reached by the Soviet Unions. There, where the New Left lapsed into critiques on totalitarianism in an effort to produce Marxist philosophy that would escape the traps of actual existing socialism, this other left theorized a continuity with a banned science that in the moment of continuity would necessitate a further point of rupture. The former group's initial dismissal of the approach taken by the latter was not simply academic. Here we go. Horkheimer became a conservative reactionary, or Adorno refused to take a principled stance on the Vietnam War, and insultingly compared the anti-imperialist student movement that would birth the Red Army fraction and other urban guerrilla movements to the Schmittler Youth. And yet, the New Left also produced a variety of committed militants and tendencies paradigmatically exemplified by the Students for Democratic Societies (STS) and the Weather Underground Organization WO. These militant currents attempted to implement the concept of New Left academic theorists, despite the fact that some of these initial theorists might have been horrified by such militancy. Here we discover tentative steps towards radical anti-imperialism, influenced also by Ho Chi Minh and Che Guevara, that was significant in that it necessitated further radicalization. In this sense, the New Left produced and intersected with the variety of important political tendencies. The earlier feminist movements, small urban guerrilla groups, and even a unity with black nationalism. It was in this context that a so-called new communist movement, quote unquote, and anti-revisionism of yesteryear emerged throughout the centuries of capitalism. Against the limitations of the New Left, these anti-revisionists raised the demands for a new return to dialectics of actually existing revolutions, against a retreat into student political or flirtations with Guevarist militancy. They defended the very concept that some sections of the New Left had claimed were out of date, producing a period of struggle that in some ways went beyond the theoretical and practical output of the New Left. Although many of these anti-revisionist militants were once trained in the discourse of the New Left, and indeed learned from some of its useful insights, they attempted to discard the limitations of this discourse in the face of revolutionary necessity. Thus, when judged accordingly to the standard of revolution, the new communist movement should be considered significant, though also limited by historical necessity. If the contributions of the new communist movement are generally forgotten by those who continue to adore the theoretical precedents of the New Left, it is because the latter were better preserved in academic discourse. Academia has a long institutional memory. Universities control libraries and sites of publications, and the ability to freeze the thought of its favored intellectuals in time of reproduce when it is necessary the popular academic books of the past decades. The militants of the new communist movement, however, did not control printing presses or journals. Most of their publications were pamphlets, programs, self-published books. When the anti-revisionism of that time collapsed, the contributions of this vanishing movement, published by organization that had ceased to exist, suddenly became scarce. Academia does not have to deal with this impediment since it is also a bourgeoisie institution. It can republish the work of its popular leftists, sell publication rights to other established presses, and propagate the thought of an intellectual movement that at one time had been outpaced. The idea of the New Left will continue to resonate in academia, but the terrain in which the theory of the new communist movement resonated, the terrain of concrete class struggle, is a space that has been largely cleansed for various reasons of revolutionary theory of the past generations. In this context, academia even preserves the memory of thinkers who were marginal to the New Left, let alone unimportant and completely disconnected from the popular social struggles of the time. For example, we can find contemporary academic leftists citing Al Draper, and rather unremarkable thinker whose, quote, socialism from below, end quote, is a better slogan than it is a theory, but dismissing all of the possible exciting theoretical developments of the new communist movement, since this movement operated largely outside of the boundaries of academia. So if history repeats itself, then we can understand the current academic fad according to the vicissitudes of the past. Those who speak of communist hypothesis and horizons are the, quote, new left of today, another generation of academic alienated from class struggle who are attempting to on the supposedly new and fresh approach to communism. At the same time, however, some of the activists who have been radicalized by a new left of today are already, like their historical antecedents, overstepping the initial limitations of their popular left discourse and slowly gravitating towards a contemporary version of anti-revisionism. We should be clear through about the limits of this previous cycle of anti-revisionism. The new communist movement was in part responsible for its own demise. In its attempt to militantly uphold revisionism, many of this movement's organizations tended to offer formulaic theoretical solutions culled from the past revolutionary texts or official statements from Communist Party of China. In its desire to actively pursue communism necessity, it would eventually become distracted by sectarian squabbles. There is no reason to repeat this mistake. Lingering organizations and parties from this period have not yet disintegrated or are proof of that period's limitations, insular, declining, and often quite cultish. Rather, a new phase of anti-revisionism at the centers of capitalism is required, one that is already in the process of emergence. Such a phase must begin by aligning itself with those revolutionary movements that are producing people's war, and in these productive movements, also producing a germ of revolutionary theory. Now, in the very moment that this generation's new left is publishing treatises on the reclamation of communism, and thus beginning to overstep its own horizons, we can glimpse the dawn of anti-revisionism that will again eclipse those radical academics who in imagining that they are embarking upon an uncharted sea of new theory, or unconsciously repeating all the errors of their predecessors. So they're disregarding historical materialism. Wild. Because not like we want to do the same thing that the old revolutionaries did, is that we should look upon them dialectically and historically, because there were some successes and some failures, and out of failures comes more successes. Electoral traps. The electoral trap. I wonder if this is going to do with electoralism. We'll find out. Hopefully. Thankfully, many of today's new communists are anti-revisionist enough to reject the electoral system. Some of them are notable for recognizing the uselessness of even participating in a specter of contemporary state-sanctioned elections. Badu has disparaged bourgeois elections, claiming that should be rejected entirely. The Invisible Committee claims, quote, that it's only against voting itself that people continue to vote. According to some of these contemporary reclamations, we are at least on an anti-revisionist trajectory. We should expect nothing less. We should even wonder why there are still communist parties and Marxist organizations that run in election attempt to enter bourgeoisie parties and base their entire strategies on a prior assumption that there can be peaceful coexistence with capitalism. Let's repeat that. We should expect nothing less. We should even wonder why there are still communist parties and Marxist organizations that run in elections, attempt to enter, like PSL, bourgeoisie parties and base their entire strategy on the a priori assumption that there can be a peaceful coexistence with capitalism. Anarchists have always been more militant in their rejection of state coexisting with capitalism. Anarchists have always been more militant in their rejection of state convictions, though not always for the right reasons. And so, the rejection of electoral trap on the part of those reclamations of communism that approach anarchy. Electoral trap on the part of those reclamations of communism that approach anarchism might not be surprising. Rather it is when we find anarchists talking about electoral practice as a valid tactic that we are surprised. There are also those amongst today new left militants of a new reclamation of communism that find such a rejection irresponsible. To be fair, this charge of irresponsibility is not premised on the doctrine of, quote, peaceful coexistence, end quote. All of those busy reclaiming communism for a new generation at least recognize that communism cannot be voted into reality, but simply on the assumption that we should not abandon any terrain of social struggle. If one party is capable of defending social welfare better than the other, it is argued then it is our responsibility to push them into power while continuing to struggle beyond the limits of the framework of social democracy. Our old arguments are wrenched from particular social and historical contexts in order to justify the practice of pragmatic electoral participation. Despite all the efforts to kick the supposedly antiquated terminology of Marxist-Leninism out the door, it returns through the window. But terminology of Marxist-Leninism out the door, it returns through the window. But stripped of its revolutionary vitality. Sometimes the old slurs of ultra-leftism is used, but with anxiety and embarrassment. Those who reject everything Lenin wrote about opportunism and organization are wont to fall back on his argument regarding electoral participation in Britain in the earlier decades of the 20th centuries and the infantile nature of refusal. Hence, Lenin becomes authoritative only in reference to electoral pragmatism. But if he has been dismissed as an authority in every other context, why should we bother to conjure his ghost in this particular area? Perhaps we are haunted by everything we have abandoned and thus cling to those aspects of the past that justify our behavior in the here and now. To treat elections as a viable space for struggle, now decades following the ascendancy of the discourse that proclaims the capitalist end of history is a grand act of cynicism. This cynicism is one that is already aware that it is not viable to assume that communism can be voted into existence. We know that elections do not matter, and that capitalism continues its murderous onslaught regardless of what party is in power. To waste time and energy then in a struggle that will not move us any closer to our distant horizon is to participate in a conviction we recognize as fraudulent. It is a bit like an unemployed biologist who pays the bills and maintains some sort of influence over their students, each teaching 6-day creationism at the private religious schools. By rejecting the theories of organizations and strategies born of necessity, we are often only capable of struggling in those reformist spaces that the current social order considers legitimate. We know nothing less an imagination of practice as anthropy. I gotta look this word, everybody. Be right back. It's a word that we all should look up anyways. It's a word that we all should look up anyways. I think we all know what atrophied is. Practice has atrophied. Movementism as a whole promotes such a strategy in lieu of the coming insurrection lurking beyond that unapproachable horizon. And instead of building a militantly structured organizational force, oh my gosh, we might as well busy ourselves with damage control within the framework of the current state of affairs. At the very least, we can achieve more results, no matter how paltry, in the space of bourgeoisie democracy than we can in the old demonstration of radical parade. Seattle and Quebec City produced nothing but spectacles. Year after year, the Arabic Spring and occupied the might of capitalism and imperialism are strong as ever. Perhaps we believe that if we are able to vote into power someone who is even marginally the might of capitalism and imperialism are strong as ever. Perhaps we believe that if we are able to vote into power someone who is even marginally sympathetic to our politics, regardless of whether or not they actually do anything, then we can be successful at something, even if it is merely a success at getting a place. Regardless of whether or not they actually do anything, then we can be successful at something, even if it is merely a success at getting a politician elected. No. Here, if it is worth wondering whether this cynical and pragmatic understanding of parliamentarism is better than the old left revision. Here, if it is worth wondering whether this cynical and pragmatic understanding of parliamentarism is better than the old left revisionist illusion about participating in bourgeoisie electoral system. While it is tempting to argue that the cynical illusion about participating in bourgeoisie electoral system. While it is tempting to argue that the cynical approach is refreshingly honest, it is likely that the other approach is more honest in that it is not participating in honest, it is likely that the other approach is more honest in that it is not participating in deceit. Indeed, those old communist parties that still run candidates in various elections do not that it is not participating in deceit. Indeed, those old communist parties that still run candidates in various elections do not recognize the contradictions of their practice. They have various theoretical strategies of dogmas that elect this. They have various theoretical strategies of dogmas that allow them to believe that they are engaged in revolutionary practice and represents the will of the proletariat. One only needs to argue for an hour with an average member of the Communist Party, CPUSA, or the Communist Party of Canada, or the Communist Party of India Marxist, member of the Communist Party, CPUSA, or the Communist Party of Canada, or the Communist Party of India Marxist, or any other similar organization to realize that this is the case. They will accuse you of being a counter-revolutionary and in league with the bourgeoisie, mainly because you challenge their political direction. They truly believe that they can vote communism into existence, or with the bourgeoisie, mainly because you challenge their political direction. They truly believe that they can vote communism into existence, or at very least organize primarily within bourgeoisie democracy. Those who believe in this is an illusion, or at very least organize primarily within bourgeoisie democracy. Those who believe in this is an illusion, however, and supplement their energies in electoral pragmatism cannot defend their practice with such a fantastical doctrine. In electoral pragmatism cannot defend their practice with such a fantastical doctrine. But what other options, or pragmatists might argue, do we have while waiting for the communist horizon and the next convergence of movement force? Waiting for the communist horizon and the next convergence of movement forces? Question mark. The answer come quickly, perhaps too quickly, since they have been the answers for decades. Rebuild ages? Question mark. the answer come quickly, perhaps too quickly, since they have been the answers for decades. Rebuild a new left that is better than the old, embedded oneself within the struggle of trade unions. The refoundationalist trap. The refoundationalist trap. So I'm glad he doesn't think that the refoundationalist trap. The refoundationalist trap. So I'm glad he doesn't think that legalism is the way to go. Thank God. It's so absurd and revisionist. It's so absurd and revisionist. The prefoundationalist trap. Rather than establishing the movement theoretically unified in revolutionary necessity, the foundationalist trap. Rather than establishing the movement theoretically unified in revolutionary necessity, this is establishing a kernel of revolutionary party of a new type. A common tendency is to instead establish processes, network of revolutionary party of a new type. A common tendency is to instead establish processes, networks, and assemblies that attempt to unify vague and fractured elements of the left that tend to resist once they are thrown together, and overarching clarity of unity, assuming, and often correctly, that the left is dead, is refounding clarity of unity, assuming, and often correctly, that the left is dead, is refoundationalism, asserts that the left's, quote, death is precisely the death that was declared by capitalism, and that in order to live again, the left must be rebuilt from the ground up. Strategy is to gather all the elements. The left must be rebuilt from the ground up. Strategy is to gather all the elements of morbid left grouplets into one grouping, and hope that something greater than the sum of its parts will emerge from the process of gathering. Here is yet another horizon projected into a distant future. A greater than the sum of its parts will emerge from the process of gathering. Here is yet another horizon projected into a distant future. A hypothesis that will magically be solved by mixing together people and groups who appear to share the same ideology. And again, there is nothing new to this approach, regardless of what some of its defenders might claim. And this refoundationalism often encourages movementivist, what some of its defenders might claim. And this refoundationalism often encourages movementivist practice when a variety of organization with competing ideologies and strategies are gathered together under one banner, and only theoretical unity that can be achieved is the most vague capitalism. Since revolutionary strategical unity that can be achieved is the most vague capitalism. Since revolutionary strategy is derived from revolutionary unity, the vagueness of theory produces a vagueness of practice, tailism, which is going behind the masses. New neo-reformism, nebulous movement, tailism, which is going behind the masses. New neo-reformism, nebulous movementism. Refoundationalism produces a variety of tactics, university talk shops, where representatives of different movements are invited to debate in closed spaces where the left gathers to watch the left talk about the left. Where representatives of different movements are invited to debate in closed spaces where the left gathers to watch the left talk about the left. Websites that advertise themselves as a revolutionary process, city assemblies filled with organizations that dislike each other. The aim is to produce the foundation of a new anti-capitalist movement that will somehow cohere from innumerable incoherent elements. The problem with this approach of a new anti-capitalist movement that will somehow cohere from innumerable incoherent elements. The problem with this approach is not the belief that, due to past failures, a new revolutionary movement needs to be built and developed, but the assumption that the historical basis of such a movement must be entirely refounded. For this assumption carries with the groundless the assumption that the historical basis of such a movement must be entirely refounded. For this assumption carries with the groundless hope that those involved in the refoundationalist projects will not bring all of the errors with them, will not involved in the refoundationalist projects will not bring all of the errors with them, will not be invested in ideologies of their own failed organization, and that the foundationalist projects as a whole will not be yet another repetition of the past and similar attempts. We know what happened to the last attempt, New Left, and the past and similar attempts. We know what happened to the last attempt, New Left, and its foundationalist projects. It was ellipsed and swept aside by the radical anti-revisionism. Historical necessity teaches projects. It was ellipsed and swept aside by the radical anti-revisionism. Historical necessity teaches us that the kernel of the militant organization, unified accordingly to revolutionary theory, is the only thing capable. Historical necessity teaches us that the kernel of the militant organization, unified accordingly to revolutionary theory, is the only thing capable of refounding a revolutionary movement. And this movement will grow by proving itself to the masses, and thus by organizing the masses according to their revolutionary movement. And this movement will grow by proving itself to the masses, and thus by organizing the masses according to their emancipatory demands, not by tailing them, not by manufacturing a disunified organization out of hands, not by tailing them, not by manufacturing a disunified organization out of already existing components, some of which do not fit together. The great revolutions of history teaches us some of which do not fit together. The great revolutions of history teaches us that we cannot produce an organization capable of fighting capitalism if we are building an organization that has little hope of producing a clear political line out of its confusion. Indeed, if we are building an organization that has little hope of producing a clear political line out of its confusion. Indeed, history should have taught us that to control the political line is to determine the movement. Inversely, to have an indeterminate movement is to lose control of the political line. And when the movement is based on indeterminate politics, however broadly anti-capitalist, those organizations who process politics, however broadly anti-capitalist, those organizations who process the most coherent political line will be those who end up redirecting and determining the organization, whatever its initial intent. Most often, this means that some versions of, quote, common sense ideology will triumph in these spaces. In this absence of ideological, some versions of, quote, common sense ideology will triumph in these spaces. In this absence of ideological coherence, we often fall back on the way we have been socialized to understand the world, and thus reformism will triumph revolution. While it is true that political lines are never static, the fact the fact a line struggle means that they are essentially the fact a line struggle means that they are essentially dynamic. They must aim for more coherence and direction than a vague that they are essentially dynamic. They must aim for more coherence and direction than a vague anti-capitalist that lacks clarity in theory and practice. Theoretical unity is itself a process. Revolutionary parties are themselves processes. And it is thus strange to pretend, as some do, that we must have a re-foundationalist process in order to produce a party, as if the party is the end result of must have a re-foundationalist process in order to produce a party, as if the party is the end result of a process rather than being the process in itself. So he's talking about the party is produced and processed by the masses themselves. That's what I'm getting. The process in itself. So he's talking about the party is produced and processed by the masses themselves. That's what I'm getting. Being through a theory and practice. And if it's correct, the masses will take that on. Beginning with a political line and demonstrate is its efficacy in concrete class struggle. Reprove nothing by forming new organization is its efficacy in concrete class struggle. Reprove nothing by forming new organizations with an already organized left rather than organizing the current unorganized. Organizations with an already organized left rather than organizing the current unorganized. Hold on. Those committed to a re-foundationalist hold on. Those committed to a re-foundationalist strategy, however, oh my gosh, whoever believes re-foundationalist strategy, however, oh my gosh, whoever believe that they are involved in revitalizing the left, and it is unlikely that this belief, which is in revitalizing the left, and it is unlikely that this belief, which is little more than a dogma, will disappear anytime soon. Even the most radical re-foundationalist project, more than a dogma, will disappear anytime soon. Even the most radical re-foundationalist projects who dare to speak the names of Lenin and Mao discover the limitations of the boundaries. They foundationalist projects who dare to speak the names of Lenin and Mao discover the limitations of the boundaries they have drawn. They too will tell the masses, will fail to pursue or even defend viewpoints we don't believe in, or we begin to develop bureaucratic practices to impose our minority viewpoint and keep the position we obtain in the movement or in one movement or another. Interesting. So basically, to bastardize yourself way into it. Like 3 times or 4. Action, socialistia's experience of paradigmatic and trade union activism on the part of communists. This economism is experienced in greater or lesser degrees by every communist who has sought to make union activism the basis of their revolutionary practice. If the situation was otherwise, after all, we would have long ago achieved the promise of Draperism, multiplied red unions. So red unions, when they say red unions, they mean communist unions or socialist unions. multiply red unions would have produced a revolutionary party. Instead, those of us who have attempted to find our communist ways within union spaces should be able to recognize some of the claims made in the above quotations. Bogged down by collective arguments so that our activism becomes a management of union survival, fighting for union leadership that is only marginally left in essence, finding ourselves on the executive or union group working groups that is politically divided, stranded in a politics were despised, who were our comrades simply because they shared the same workspace. Every strike, no matter how our immediate economic demands, our demands are met, regardless of those demands that challenge the economic system as a whole. We shut down the lines and go back to work. Sometimes we end the strikes even earlier, acceding to the strength of the employer in these times of austerity. And because in any case, we must keep the union alive. Immediate economic demands, of course, are not insignificant. We have to put food on the table and pay the bills. We want job security and benefits. Solidarity amongst workers is laughable, and it would be a mistake to impose unions and union drives because they are not as revolutionary as a communist party. The option, however, should never be the false dilemma of liquidating communist practice within the unions or imposing unionization on principle. To reject communism, economism, is recognize that trade unions, particularly at the centers of capitalism, may not be our primary spaces of organizations, should not produce a knee-jerk should not plating a practice limited by reformism with revolutionary agitation. Hence the mistake is to veil those immediate demands which amount to a level of survival that is possible because of an organized workplace with the trappings of communism. Revolutionary consciousness demands more than a consciousness determined by immediate demands, which is why today it is more likely to be found amongst the non-unionized workers who have not through union economism been integrated with the system. We cannot find, as a general rule, the worker with, quote, nothing left to lose, end quote, in first world trade unions. This unionized workers have much to lose in the sense of immediate economic privileges. If they were to ever succeed in painting their union red, which is why, of course, it does not happen, not now, not at the centers of capitalism. So there's his thoughts on unionism, which I agree. Imagine. Hopefully this will be it. I know we have. The previous chapters, we confronted those theories that attempted reclamation of the name communism that were little more than collaborations with the current state of affairs due to their struggle and pretend that imagination itself is struggle. In actuality, this is an ironic demonstration of the limited imagination. Regardless of one's creative feats and theoretical fantasies and relegations, Regulations? It's not regulations. What the fuck? I'm saying this word wrong. Hold on a second. Relegation, that's why. Relegation of the question of organizations and strategies to the possibilities of spontaneity is rather uncreative. To assume that communism will just happen at distant point X based on our grandiose assertions and the combination of social movements is rather bland. So what, then, do these reclamations tell us about reviving an anti-revisionist and revolutionary tradition if we are not to endorse the traps of bourgeoisie elections, refoundationalism, and communism? In their inability to creatively grapple with the necessity, we might be able to learn something significant, namely, how not to think. Trenquin's theories of Bloom is a paradigm example that this imaginative lack of imagination, after a whirlwind of theoretical eclecticism from the Deborn and Bildrillard to Agabin and all other Joyce, all through Joyce. They assert the name of a collective under which they would write their next momentous bestseller, The Invisible Committee and the Openly Secret Society, a public conspiracy in the instance of anonymous subjectivization. Can't say the damn word. Those names is everywhere, and the headquarters nowhere. The experimental revolutionary polarity of the imaginary party, the Invisible Committee, not a revolutionary organization, but a higher level of reality and metaphysical territory of secessions with all the magnitudes of the whole world of its own. The playing area where positive creation alone can accomplish the great immigration of the economy from the world. Very imaginative language to simply conclude that there is no point in building a militant and organized movement in the real world. After all, how can one organize a mystical, blanquist society that operates primarily upon the metaphysical terrain? The solution is to Mira can emerge spontaneously through our creative play, which of course means that our only responsibility is to write and read theory, or at most embark on great acts of literary and artistic production. And yet someone or some people decide that it is worth speaking in the name of this metaphysical organization, despite of its impossibility of actually existing. Because 5 years later, we were given the coming insurrection by the Invisible Committee. Although there is something more concrete in the Invisible Committees and flinching or reclamation of the name communism, it is reclaimed only insofar as to appropriate it from an ideological tradition it despises. Indeed, it refers to those Marxist-Leninists who developed the term historically as its enemies. More importantly, though, is the fact that the Invisible Committee relies on a hazy understanding of the theory of insurrection, a strategy that has only met with failure after the October Revolution, but cleansed of its Leninism. Spontaneous insurrection without the wretched business of a civil war and the assumption that the military and police forces will be won over by the fraternalization and insurrectionists because he is denied merely on the assumption that the state's arms bodies of women and men will not violently put down untrained insurrectionists, that they will be politically won over by the insurrection itself. But the state has and will put down insurrections, and every insurrection since 1917 has indeed been violently suppressed. Why pretend otherwise? Because we do not want to think through the hard question demanded by the necessity. The uprising by Franco Berardi, Berardi, veritably shuddered in its attempts to hide from the fact of revolutionary necessity. Here, the revolution is not even something that happens in a concrete sense, that has to do with unavoidable social truths. Ignored are the facts that there are armies trained to control population, weapons monopolized by the ruling class, and the coercive, can't say that word either, state apparatus that will not deign to avoid a bloodbath, designed to avoid bloodbaths when it is challenged. Rather, Bernard's revolution is something that happens in the imagination, I can't say that. The linguistic phenomenon, the business of poetry, since the best satire is delivered with a straight face, it is attempting to speculate on whether or not but Berardi is being serious or lampooning other chink social theories. After all, in the face of the entire population, who are even now being bombed and occupied, these everyday massacres that are part of the normative operations of the flows of finance, Bernard examines to seriously suggest the linguistic that poetic revolution that is neither violence nor nonviolence is tantamount to spitting in the face of the wretched of the earth and telling them that they should resist by writing poetry. To the above three examples, we can add the theories of communization, quote unquote, promoted by Theory Communista and in notes, influenced by, but critically of, the left libertarian communism of Gilles, David, and Socialismia Barbaria, which is a different language. They peddle the theory that is not, oh my gosh, they peddle the theory that is yet another example of the same movementist. Jesus Christ, this guy gives me words that my tongue and my lips cannot produce. Blah, blah, blah. Movementist practice with the communist mask. The problem of theater communist is the pragmatic, oh my gosh, the pragmatism, the programmatism of the past cycles of revolution, cycles they think are finished, while we should agree that there are different cycles of revolution, historical moments, and continuity and rupture. It is notable that these communization theorists are incapable of thinking through the cycles of struggles unleashed by the Chinese Revolution, aside from dismissing it as, oh my gosh, programmatic. let alone the contemporary cycles of struggles demonstrated by a storm of people's wars that began in 1988, mentioned at the onset of this treatise. One might as well be a revisionist and an open collaborator with capitalism and imperialism to abide by the logic of these theoretical reclamations of the name of communism, even if those who limit their reclamation to a vague talk of hypothesis, a horizon refuse to go this far down the road of the supposedly new communist imagery. This is a terrain into which their trajectory falls. In the past, these speculations were utopian, but to be utopian now, after so many earth-shaking revolutions wherein the masses won almost as much as they lost, is the plummet into revisionist abyss, to wait in hope of spontaneity while in the meantime practicing a peaceful coexistence with the brutal reality. The solution, however, is indeed imaginations and creativity, but not a groundless imagination or creativity that cannot think through concrete problems, that reifies the current state of affairs. Not what we need is a kind of imagination and creativity that we find in other sciences, imagining a future of creatively building this future based upon the truths won through the past struggles. The history of successful or nearly successful revolutions and people's war are instances in which revolutionary unity, however temporarily, was actually built. Let me look ahead real quick. 79. Oh, hold on. Looking ahead. Ooh, I might have to end early. 79. I think I can go to 84. Yeah, we'll go to 84. 79. All right. However, wait, was I on 79? Instance which the revolutionary unity, however temporarily, was built. Okay. This is a past which radiates. What? Oh my gosh! I don't like how I can't. Radiates. Hold on. This is a past which radiates multiple necessities, the most important of which is communism. We predict, however, the ways in which some of these theorists will respond to the analogy of scientific truth. They will remind us of the dangers of techno-scientific rationality and a totalizing nightmare of scientific progress. Since we addressed this complaint earlier, there is no reason to defend scientific necessity here. Instead, let us engage with these theories' lack of imagination according to the history of imagination and creativity itself, the history of the literature, music, and arts that are treated as significant, for example, by the Tonquin group, the Tinquin group. In the universities of creativity, the unreflective repetition of previous artistic productions is usually understood as unremarkable. If they were to encounter an artist unaware of the history of their craft, posturing as original while producing Duchamp's work in the earlier 19th century, we would treat them as arrogant and barely worthy of consideration. We know there is a history to literature and art that might teach us something, and this is the basis of any thoughtful judgment made in the terrain of imagination. Even Taekwon believes that there is merit in this kind of judgment, if only implicitly there is a reason it chooses to reference James Joyce rather than Dan Brown, Paul Verlaine, rather than Robert Frost. That is not reducible to literary elitism. What does these theories offer? Then, even according to the general standards of creative quality. Jesus Christ, I cannot say words today. The same momentous spontaneity, the same vague insurrection, the same distant horizon. Eclecticism is barely imaginative. It is about as creative as the elementary school college. And in this eclectic mobilization of theory that is only imaginative in appearance, there is a return to all of the utopian mistakes of the past. New returns. And then we got a little bit more to go. To speak of the communist necessity is to also speak of a very particular situation in which the universalized communist theory might be articulated of concrete praxis. And since talk of hypothesis, possibilities, horizons, produce a return to the ineffective movementism, how can we recognize a new return to an organized, a totalized revolutionary practice when such a return is supposedly forbidden by the failures of actual existing socialism? This is a question, unfortunately, that is posed at the centers of capitalism, where the word communism, after decades of suppression, is finally reemerging. Against this fad of reclaiming a name in which it attached a dubious concept, we assert that the single revolutionary program that emerges from the concrete analysis of the concrete situation on behalf of the dynamic movement is worth more than 1,000 academic Marxist books or thousands of eclectic neo-communist theory. If communism is a necessity, then we cannot accept abstract reclamations that cannot grasp the need to make it a reality. We need to demand the concrete. We need to focus on literature produced by movements that are active in class struggle, and due to this activity have also produced a theory that is itself generated by the necessity of struggle. Nor can we ignore the fact that revolutionary communism has already reclaimed right at the moment of the collapse of actually existing socialism in the People's War in Peru, in the birth of the revolutionary internationalist movement, in the launching of the People's War in Nepal, in the current People's War in India. These movements have spoken the name of communism, despite failure and setback, without, ameliorating, I gotta look at this word, ameliorate, okay, there we go. I couldn't pronounce. Ameliorating, which it means making something bad unsatisfactory, making something bad or unsatisfactory better. Okay, so they're trying to make it better. Okay, got it. Got it. All right. Oh my gosh. Stop doing this. All right. Ameliorating themselves in some, oh my gosh, and chaotic movementism, inoculated movementism. I don't know why they have been mostly ignored by the current intellectual fad of reclaiming the once banned name is worth considering. Why self-proclaimed communists become annoyed when some of us speak of these actual revolutionary movements, complaining that they have heard enough about People's War and yet become excited with every doom. Morbid populism should make us wonder. In many ways, movementist strategy represents a return to utopian communism that Marx and Engels once expended so much energy combating in order to place the practice of making revolution upon scientific foundations. Indeed, Engels' focus on necessity represents this attempt to break from utopian idealism so that the pursuit of revolution could be more than an idle dream, a post-political hallucination. The errors of history are not so easily silenced. In there will always be new returns to utopian anti-capitalism for as long as capitalism remains hegemonic. Unlike the so-called hard sciences, where previous paradigms are only endorsed by the minority of people who are generally understood as backwards, the science of revolution is a messy affair where innumerable dead ends are preserved as vestigals. Vestigal. I don't know how to say it. I'll be right back. It's vestigial. And here's the vestigial. Former or very small remnants of something that was once more larger than another one. All right. Back to effects, back to here, back to here, back to here, and then here. Vestigials, philosophies that masquerade as science. So, in the face of the nightmare of capitalism, it is often tempting to resist with idle dreams of utopian horizons and pretend that these dreams, of philosophically attractive as they sometimes might seem, are akin to revolutionary science. Often it is even more tempting to discard the terminology of science altogether, adopting philosophical skepticism, for it is quite dangerous for those who wish to avoid the problems of necessity to accept the revolution and history can be treated scientifically. Indeed, in these days where totality is seen as suspect and contingency has become a standard of theoretical labor, the speaking of science is often treated as an act of bad faith. Better to speak only of philosophy and moored from the totalizing confines of science, and thus plunge back into philosophical socialism of the 19th century, utopianism. The problem with the new return to utopianism is that those most taken with such an approach of communism often believe that they are indeed engaged into something new. The amnesia intrinsic to this idealism prevents them from realizing that it is also a return. They're quite willing to accept that they are returning to the name of communism, but unwilling to accept that their manner of speaking this name is fetishistic, like fetishizing. Search for the new revolutionary strategy. It is it is return to a species of communism that, as Marx and Engels recognized, as incapable of manifesting revolution because it is incapable of recognizing its own necessity. Thus, there can be no absolute dustbin of history, quote unquote, not until communism emerges, because we will always return, often in new ways, to the flawed ideas of yesteryear, just as our enemy also remobilizes and rearticulates the reactionary ideologies of the past. As Marx noted, just when we assume we are engaging in revolutionizing ourselves, quote, in creating something that has never yet existed, precisely in such periods of revolutionary crisis, we anxiously conjure up the spirit of the past. The trick, however, is to discover what historical spirits we are conjuring, that we mask, we are donning. What mask are we donning? And what are we, and that we are even donning them on in the first place. Otherwise, we run the risk of, farcistical historical repetition. These repetitions have already happened and are happening again. Whereas the old communist utopianism spoke of kingdoms of reason and imagined emancipatory social systems that divorce from the material and social relations. Quote, the more they are completely worked out, the more they could not avoid drifting off into a pure fantasies. These new utopianism has drifted further into fantasies by the hypothesizing a distant horizon that we could possibly inevitably reach on one apocalyptic day. Now we have a utopianism that remains utopian about the practical means of achieving this fantasy, while at the same time occasionally declaring fidelity to Marx or even Lenin. This utopianism is a new return because its manifestation can be observed in all of the spontaneous currents of the early 20th century that attempted to distinguish themselves from the theory of militant and vanguard revolutionary party by arguing for the self-organization of the working class. Although the utopian communists of today might claim that they know where the Leninist model of organization leads, to Stalin, to the gulags, to totalitarianism, I can't say it. They are often unreflective of the momentous model that has never succeeded in placing us on the road of revolutionary upheaval. The former models, regardless of its eventual failures, brought us closer to the supposed horizon of communism. The latter produced the rationale for tailing disarticulated mass movements in the name of a horizon. In the name of a horizon, these movements were not even trying to reach. So if we must have a new return to the past revolutionary processes, then we should be aware of what process was the larger failure, the utopian theories and self-organizations that lead nowhere, or the concrete theories that organize revolutionary necessities that produce world historical revolutions that, with all their errors, still shook the foundations of bourgeoisie reality. In thinking through this question, we should be led to recognize that today utopianism amounts to making social peace with capitalism. Unfortunately, those who are committed to this resurgent utopianism would argue that the new return to the communism that developed through the path of necessity is also, and can only be, tragic and, I gotta look up this word again. because I gotta say it right. Farcical. 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 I can't say it. Despite the return to the name communism, this new utopianism, due to its emergence in the heart of left-wing academia and petite bourgeoisie students' movements, has absorbed the postmodern fear of those who speak of a communist necessity, the fear of that which is totalizing and thus totalitarian. The future to develop any concrete strategies of overthrowing capitalism instead of being treated as a serious deficiency is apprehended by as a strength. The movement can be all things for all people, everything for some, everything for some, everyone, everywhere and nowhere. Quote, for when we are truly everywhere, we will be nowhere, for we will be everyone. I have no idea what that means. Sorry, everybody. But where did this utopianism lead? Where can it lead? Nowhere. Obviously, which was not the same as everywhere. These nebulous proposals sound nice, might even be more enjoyable to read than the party program produced by a coherent revolutionary movement, but they are devoid of the strategies necessary for making a sustainable existence beyond the limits of capitalism a reality. What is interesting about this new return to utopian communism, however, is that it has somehow succeeded in veiling itself in praxis, or due to this movementist spontaneism, lack of praxis, but that by the 1990s was considered the providence of an anarchism and anti-capitalism that saw communism as a great mistake. In the days leading up to Seattle, at the heart of global imperialism, those who spoke of refusing to take power of some new movement that could spontaneously end capitalism upon reaching a critical mass, and of the political fantasies described, but of course not prescribed, in We Are Everywhere, would have eschewed the word communism, since it stank of failure and totalitarianism and everything they were taught to despise in bourgeois high school textbooks. Now the word communism is being spoken into these spaces, and though a forbidding name, those who speak in it are attempting to reconfigure the concept. Even the invisible committee that imagines its own fantastical horizons for a coming insurrection without the Leninist Party, and remobilize the word communism when only decades earlier the same people probably would have been made anxious whenever it was spoken. In the face of this utopianism, when it is important to argue instead for the return of the revolutionary traditions that treat communism as a necessity, for a dogmatic assertion of something Lenin said in 1917, or something Marx said in 1848, but a return to the living science of this communism that originated with Marx and Engels, loops through Leninism, twists through Mao, and is still open to the future. All returns are always new, as Lenin learned when he creatively applied Marxism to his social context, as Mao learned when he creatively applied Marxism-Leninism to his social context, as those of us who have understand that communism must be understood as a necessity are trying to learn when we return to these past developments of necessity with the perspective that this always knew that this is always new because society changes, but also a return because society is burdened by the weight of dead generations. Such a return must be concrete, must be able to speak the history of universal revolutionary necessities into each and every particular context in which we live and struggle. It is meaningless to only return to a name, to an uncritically inherited method of struggle that derives from the focus on vague hypotheses and horizons, unless we are willing to pursue everything this name came to mean over the course of revolutionary struggle since Marx. From when we return anew over and over to the necessity of making communism, we will be confronted with great difficulty and the always imminent potential of failure. So much still needs to be accomplished. Let us advance the struggle for more communism to concrete realities, and let us cease this prattle about some ideal communism and that exists outside of time and space, and instead, with all the messiness this would imply, return to the recognition that is necessity requires a new return to revolutionary communist theory and experiences won from history. And we'll stop there because it says coda. I have no idea what coda is. It's kind of weird. What is coda? Let me look. So this is what I got from there. A concluding passage of a piece of movement, a piece or movement typically formed in addition to basic structures. Okay. So we're going to learn about that tomorrow. And we're going to stop on page 85. I don't know what comment. I couldn't find. Looking at. Okay. All right. Learning about what the dictatorship of the proletariat is good. So, that's the first establishment of the lower phase of communism, is the dictatorship of the proletariat, socialists in the socialist line, lower phase of communism. So it's good. That's a good one. But it's a lot of shit talking about how this place is doing this and this place is doing this and they need to be doing more of this. So. Stuff like that. So that's a good thing. There's not that many people want to come up. So it's alright. It's alright. It's alright. It's alright. So what I'll do, so I did read a little bit over, is I'll go and feed Rufus now.